So much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's amazing to see so many known faces and also see so many new faces within the Green family. And I want to start by talking about a subject that's probably going to play a big role here and in everything we do as a Green Party, but sometimes kind of misses the marks when it comes to wording: climate protection. If we talk about climate protection, we talk about social existences, we talk about life, we talk about prosperity. We've seen it only within this year when we had millions of fees that needed to be paid in Italy because of a flooding, when we had 5,000 people in Congo missing in 1 week because of natural catastrophes. And when I talk to farmers in Germany, then they tell me that they can't live anymore because the drought is destroying their living existence. And if you think about this, you see that the climate crisis is not something that happens in the future. It's not something that happens anywhere in the world, but it's already here. And it is costing lives, it's costing our health, and it is costing social and economic existences. And when you think about that, maybe the word climate protection doesn't really fit the reality. Because climate protection always sounds like we are protecting something abstract. We are protecting something far away from us. But to be honest, the climate and nature, they are not dependent on us human beings. They don't need us. They don't really care about what is happening to us. So if we talk about climate protection, what we are actually talking about is protecting our elders living in care homes and being most affected by the heat. What we are actually talking about is protecting our children and their right to have a democratic future on this planet. When we're talking about climate protection, what we are actually talking about is protecting people we love, our colleagues, our friends from schools, our families, and therefore I think climate protection is about nothing else but human protection. And that's a question of social responsibility, but it's also a question of economic responsibility. I think like many Greens, I have been asked in the past, but Ms. Long, are you for climate protection or are you for prosperity? You have to decide. And I think within the last years we have seen this contradiction is actually nothing else but bullshit. Because we see that companies make the decision in Germany. I come from the south of Germany, which has a big problem with that, because the companies go to the north because what they have there is secure, renewable energy. And we see on an international level, when we look at the US, where with the Inflation Reduction Act, billions are being invested in new technologies, in renewable energies, in secure jobs, that we don't have something that we have had for a lot of time, a race to the bottom. So who has the least standards? Who produces the most cheap and therefore the most climate destroyingly? But we have something like a race to the top. So who is going to be able to attract new technologies? Who's going to be able to attract renewable energies and therefore also secure jobs for the future? And the question is, if with this race to the top, Europe is going to be left behind, or Europe is going to go through the finish line. And this is the decision we are taking now when we talk about the Green Deal, and not just talk about it in big words and speeches, but talk about how it's actually going to be put into reality, how it's actually going to work for the next years if we are going to go through the finish line. And Joe Biden once said, if I hear climate, I hear jobs. And this is what it's really about. If I hear climate, I hear secure jobs, I hear good infrastructure, and I hear real prosperity. But then it's not going to be the prosperity from the 90s. It's not going to be the prosperity for the few. Because I think when we talk about wealth, and we've had a big discussion in Germany if we should talk about wealth as a Green Party. And many people said, well, isn't this like a concept where we not only exploited the nature, but very little people actually were having a part of this wealth. And yes, that is actually true. It's true on a global level, but also on a national level. And therefore, I think if we talk about prosperity now, if we talk about climate protection now, we need to talk about social justice. We need to talk about justice in general, need to talk about social protection, because the recipes of the 90s trickle down in our economy have failed us. They failed us here in Europe, and we know that if a few are profiting from the way we do our economy and the other ones are left behind, it will not work out in the long run and will not be good for our countries. And therefore, if we talk about prosperity, we need to talk about the prosperity not for the few, but the prosperity for the many. The prosperity not just for the 10%, but for the 90%. The prosperity of the people that get up every morning, go to work. The prosperity of the people that build up our renewable energy. The prosperity of the people that care for the elder in living homes. The prosperity of all the people that keep Europe running. And therefore, I say it's time for a new promise of justice and prosperity for the many in Europe. I'm 29 years old, and therefore I had the big luck to grow up in a mostly peaceful Europe. And to be rather honest with you, I think in many cases, for me, I have taken many things for granted until last year that we saw were not for granted. For me, it was kind of normal to live in a democratic Europe. For me, it was kind of normal to live in a peaceful Europe. And of course, I knew the history, but it still felt like this is something that's going to be forever. And then we had two things happening throughout the last years. We had fascist parties gaining powers in many countries in Europe and showing me that democracy was fought for in the past and is not for granted, but needs to be protected every single day. And we saw the war in Ukraine. We saw how Russia attacked Ukraine and how peace in Europe was not for granted as well. And how, for me, I think this happened to many younger people, but also to many older people. I talked to many people in the last few months in Germany that have experienced World War II or grew up in a Germany right after World War II. And those people say, we are afraid. We are afraid if we see a war happening in Europe. We are afraid if we see a right extremist party in Germany gaining up to 20%, not just in the east of Germany, but in all of Germany. We're afraid that these fundamental rights of democracy, this fundamental functioning of how we live together, of how we tackle social issues, of how we tackle climate issues, of how we live in Europe and how we protect our peace are going to be lost. And I really think that in this moment we are in a fundamental situation here in Europe of protecting the peace and therefore also protecting Europe. Because this was the promise, and I think the European Union is not perfect. It's far from it. It needs to be reformed. It needs to be made better. It needs to be made more just. But it was the promise of living together in peace and not in conflict. And for me, it always meant, and I think my grandma said this to me once, Europe for her meant it's better to be on the negotiation table for 10 months than to have one night fighting against each other in war. And I think this is really the promise of Europe, and this is what is at cost now, this is what is under attack, and this is something we as a Green Party are going to protect. When we are talking about the war in Ukraine, we saw how Putin used military to attack people, women, children, to kill people, and to try to fulfill his imperialistic dreams. But we also saw how he used energy prices as a kind of force against the rest of Europe, of the European Union. And I think we saw it in Germany, how it hit us really hard. And for me, the last year, it was also kind of a bet which Vladimir Putin took, where he said, well, I'm going to use these energy prices and I'm going to keep them apart. I'm going to destroy their democracy as well. And to be fair, within this year we have shown how strong this democracy is. We have shown that we in Germany, but also we in Europe, did not just stop supporting Ukraine in the moment where it got hard, that we did not stop supporting Ukraine in the moment prices go up. We showed that we are able to use instruments from energy cap prices to kind of taking away the profits from the oil companies that were making so much profit of this war. And we showed that our democracy is strong, but now it's really about protecting this democracy and therefore protecting the main instruments we have to keep prosperity, social justice, and climate protection. And I mean, we see today when we are standing here in Spain, what is happening in the parliament here today. And I think this really showed, and I want to quote Terry here because it's about inspiring speeches. And you were with our Women's Assembly just a few weeks ago. And I think there you said something that really gave a lot of us a lot of inspiration. And this is that we are seeing that what we have fought for in the past really needs to be fought for today. We are seeing that everything we had in the past is not for granted, and everything we want for the future needs to be fought for in really difficult, tiring, sometimes really frustrating situations. But I think we see it here in Spain, we see it all over Europe, and we're going to see it in the next European election. Together, we can fight as the Green Party, and together, we can win. There's a big debate at the moment in Germany about this climate group, and I don't want to go really into it. They're calling themselves the last generation because of the climate crisis. And I think in some ways, when we want to win, when we want to fight, we also need to have a vision for the future. And it's a vision that's not going to be based on what we are going to lose. It's not going to be based on what we have to give up. It's not going to be based on what we are the last of. But to be honest, we can look for it from the totally whole new direction and say, if we do it right, if we invest now in Europe, if we do climate protection, if we do our things right, and if we fight for democracy, we can be the first generation. We can be the first fossil-free generation of Europe. We can be the first economic place where prosperity is not based on the destruction of our nature living. We can be the first just generation. We can be the first generation that combines climate protection and social justice. And I think this is our task as the Green Party. We are going to be everything and do everything for Europe, for our generation, to be the first fossil-free and just generation of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricarda. Muchas gracias, Ricarda. Como ya es casi mediodía y la verdad.
Well, we are approaching midday and we've been behaving very well. We'll take a 30-minute break.